May 14, 1943, the dense jungle ravines of Attu Island, Alaska. Sergeant Paul Tatsuguchi of the Imperial Japanese Army crept forward through the fog, leading 200 infantrymen toward what intelligence promised would be a lightly defended American supply depot. The temperature hovered just above freezing. Visibility measured in feet, not yards. The wind carried the metallic smell of the Bering Sea, 3 miles to the north. Tatsuguchi's advance scouts had reported the same thing for the past hour. No resistance, no contact, just empty foxholes and abandoned equipment scattered across the volcanic rock and tundra grass. Then the first man triggered the wire. The explosion wasn't large. A single M1 fragmentation grenade. Standard issue, nothing remarkable. What made Tatsuguchi freeze mid-step was what came next. Another blast 30 feet to the left, then another, then a fourth, fifth, and sixth in rapid succession, each one triggered by men instinctively diving for cover and hitting more tripwires in the process. Within 90 seconds, 12 men were down, screaming in the fog, and the entire column had gone to ground in a minefield that shouldn't exist. Except it wasn't a minefield, it was something else entirely. What Tatsuguchi and his men had stumbled into was the handiwork of a single American Army engineer sergeant who had violated direct orders, ignored official doctrine, and jury-rigged a defensive system using a technique that training manuals specifically prohibited. For the next 6 hours, that system would transform a vulnerable gap in American lines into a killing ground that tactical analysts would study for the next 80 years. By the spring of 1943, the Aleutian Islands Campaign had become America's forgotten war. While the public fixated on the Solomon Islands and North Africa, 11,000 American troops struggled to survive on Attu, the westernmost scrap of United States territory, closer to Tokyo than to Washington, D.C. The island's value was purely strategic: deny Japan a launching point for attacks on Alaska's mainland and prevent enemy submarines from using its bays for resupply. The terrain made Vietnam's jungles look hospitable. Volcanic peaks rose 3,000 feet from sea level, their slopes covered in tundra that could swallow a man to his waist. Fog persisted for weeks at a time. Temperatures swung from below freezing at night to barely above during the day, creating a constant cycle of freeze and thaw that turned the ground into a slurry of mud and ice. Trench foot incapacitated more soldiers than enemy fire. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes with ruthless efficiency. The tactical challenge facing American forces was simple and brutal. 2,500 entrenched Japanese defenders who had spent 8 months fortifying every ravine, ridge, and valley. Intelligence estimates suggested the enemy had constructed over 40 miles of interconnected tunnels, many heated by geothermal vents. Standard infantry assaults repeatedly stalled against interlocking fields of fire that Japanese machine gunners had calculated down to the yard. What made the situation particularly desperate was the American supplies situation. Engineers had managed to establish only 2 functioning supply routes from the beachhead to forward positions. Everything else required hand-carrying ammunition, food, and medical supplies through mountain passes that enemy mortars had pre-registered. A single Japanese breakthrough to those supply lines would cut off 4 battalions and turn the entire operation into a disaster. Combat engineers bore the impossible burden of defending these routes while simultaneously building them. The 7th Infantry Division's engineer companies operated with a brutal calculus. They had enough men to build fortifications or patrol for infiltrators, but not both. Standard doctrine called for establishing defensive perimeters using conventional obstacles, barbed wire, anti-personnel mines, and interlocking fields of fire from machine gun positions. The problem was time. Japanese probing attacks came every night, and construction of proper defenses required daylight hours that engineering crews needed for road work. The statistics backed up the desperation. American forces on Attu were consuming 12 tons of ammunition daily while resupplying only 8. Medical evacuation capacity could handle 40 casualties per day. They were averaging 73. The weather grounded transport aircraft 3 days out of every 5, turning supply schedules into optimistic fiction. Engineers received a standard allocation of 50 M1 fragmentation grenades per company per week, intended for close-quarters combat and demolition work, not for static defense. Using grenades as booby traps violated Army doctrine for a specific reason. They lacked the safety features of purpose-built mines. A fragmentation grenade triggered by a tripwire became a hazard to friendly patrols, required constant monitoring to prevent accidental detonation, and couldn't be recovered if the defensive line shifted. Training manuals were explicit on this point. Field Manual 5-31, Landmines and Booby Traps, stated, "Hand grenades will not be employed as substitutes for standard anti-personnel mines, except in emergency situations where proper mines are unavailable and where friendly forces can maintain continuous observation of the trapped area." The same manual specified that any improvised explosive traps required approval from battalion-level command and documentation of their precise locations. By May 12th, that doctrine was colliding with reality. Japanese intelligence had identified the supply route gaps, and prisoner interrogations revealed that a major push was coming within 48 hours. The 7th Division's engineer companies had exactly 63 operational anti-personnel mines remaining in their inventory, enough to cover perhaps 200 yards of frontage. The vulnerable sectors measured over 3 miles. Sergeant First Class Thomas Hatton, a coal miner from West Virginia before Pearl Harbor, was staring at a section of ravine he had been ordered to defend with 8 men, 4 machine guns, and whatever materials he could scrounge. Japanese tactical planning for the Attu operation assumed American engineering capabilities would mirror their performance in earlier Pacific campaigns. After studying reports from Guadalcanal and New Guinea, Imperial Army staff officers concluded that U.S. forces excelled at large-scale construction. Airfields, supply depots, port facilities, but struggled with rapid defensive improvisations. Japanese doctrine emphasized speed and aggression precisely because American units required time to establish the fortified positions where their firepower advantages dominated. A captured tactical assessment from the IJA 303rd Independent Infantry Battalion recovered after the battle stated, "Enemy engineering units demonstrate rigid adherence to doctrine. Defensive obstacles follow predictable patterns that can be identified through reconnaissance. Minefield placement conforms to geometric patterns described in captured manuals. Gaps between fortified positions remain consistent with American defensive spacing of 50 to 100 meters. That assessment was correct 98% of the time. American military engineering was systematic, methodical, and effective, precisely because it followed established procedures that worked. The Japanese advantage came from identifying those patterns and exploiting the gaps that doctrine created. For the American engineers on Attu, the problem wasn't lack of skill or courage, it was mathematics. To properly defend 3 miles of ravine and ridge, according to field manual specifications, would require 42 machine gun positions with interlocking fields of fire, approximately 800 anti-personnel mines creating a defensive belt 60 yards deep, barbed wire obstacles totaling 6,000 linear feet, and continuous observation posts every 300 yards. The 7th Division's engineer allocation for that sector included 11 machine guns, 63 mines, 4,000 feet of wire, and 47 combat engineers who also had to maintain the supply road. Sergeant Hatton's specific sector presented the worst gap. A steep-walled ravine descended from Japanese-controlled high ground directly toward the main supply route. The ravine bottom measured 30 feet wide, too narrow for effective machine gun crossfire, too constricted for maneuver, and perfectly suited for Japanese infiltration tactics. Previous nights had already seen enemy probing attacks through this exact approach. Hatton's orders were clear: hold that ravine with his 8-man squad until proper fortifications could be constructed. That construction timeline was estimated at 5 days. Intelligence suggested the Japanese attack would come in 48 hours. Standard defensive options had already been exhausted. The ravine's walls were too steep for effective barbed wire placement. The volcanic rock prevented digging foxholes deeper than 18 inches. The fog that persisted 16 hours per day made visual observation beyond 30 feet impossible. Installing conventional anti-personnel mines would require more than the squad's entire allocation just to cover the first 50 yards of the approach. What Hatton did have was his combat experience from North Africa, a memory of copper mine blasting techniques from his civilian work, and 4 crates of M1 fragmentation grenades that had been allocated for demolition work. He also had something else: a willingness to ignore the exact regulation his commanding officer had briefed 3 days earlier. Then came an opportunity that desperation makes look like inspiration. Before we continue, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what you know about the Aleutian Islands Campaign. Drop a comment below and let me know if you'd heard about the Battle of Attu before. Most people haven't, despite it being the only land battle fought on incorporated U.S. territory during World War II. And if you're enjoying these deep dives into forgotten corners of military history, hit that subscribe button. These stories take serious research to get the details right, and knowing you're out there makes it all worthwhile. Sergeant Thomas Hatton was not a reckless soldier. His service record from the 7th Infantry Division noted him as methodical, safety-conscious, and reliable under pressure. The 32-year-old had spent 7 years working underground in West Virginia coal mines before enlisting, where shortcuts got men killed and following procedure kept them alive. But on May 12th, standing in that fog-shrouded ravine, with orders to defend the indefensible, methodology had to bend. The concept came from 2 sources. First, his mining experience with delayed charges, setting multiple explosive charges in sequence so that the first blast would trigger sympathetic detonations in neighboring charges. Second, a memory from training exercises at Fort Ord, where a clumsy private had knocked over a crate of grenades, and Hatton had watched in frozen horror as the safety pins remained seated despite the impact. The grenades themselves were stable. It was the firing mechanism that created the danger. The M1 fragmentation grenade operated through a simple but effective system. Pull the pin, release the safety lever, and a spring-loaded striker hits the primer, igniting a 4 to 5 second fuse. The genius of Hatton's prohibited technique was recognizing that you could separate those steps. The pin could be pulled in advance. The safety lever could be held in place by something other than a human hand. And the release of that lever could be triggered by an enemy soldier who had no idea what he was stepping into. Hatton spent May 12th and 13th working with 2 specialists from his squad: Corporal James Becker, a former automotive mechanic from Detroit, and Private First Class Raymond Chen, who had worked in his family's hardware store in San Francisco's Chinatown. What they built violated doctrine but followed a ruthless logic. Each trap used a single M1 grenade with its pin removed. The safety lever was held in place by a thin wooden wedge carved from ammunition crate planks. The wedge was connected to tripwire made from communication wire, stretched at ankle height across the ravine floor. The wire's tension was calibrated carefully, loose enough that wind wouldn't trigger it, tight enough that a man's leg would provide the necessary pull. When the wire yanked the wedge free, the safety lever would spring open, the striker would fire, and 4 seconds later, the grenade detonated. The innovation that made Hatton's system genuinely effective was the spacing and geometry. He didn't create a linear barrier across the ravine. Instead, he established a 3-dimensional maze where each grenade was positioned to drive attackers toward the location of another trap. A soldier hearing the distinctive metallic ping of a safety lever releasing would instinctively dive for cover, directly into another tripwire. The grenades were spaced at irregular intervals, some 15 feet apart, others 40, creating an unpredictable pattern that prevented the enemy from establishing safe movement paths. The second innovation was the layering. Hatton placed traps in 3 depth zones. The first zone, positioned 200 yards from his squad's foxholes, used 6 grenades to create an initial warning system. The second zone, 100 yards forward, concentrated 23 grenades in a kill zone barely 40 yards wide. The third zone, closest to his defensive positions, held another 8 grenades positioned specifically to target wounded soldiers attempting to withdraw or reinforcements moving forward. Over 48 hours, Hatton's squad installed 37 grenade traps across a sector of ravine that conventional wisdom said required 200 men to defend. They worked at night during fog, navigating by compass and counting steps to map each trap's location. Becker kept a hand-drawn chart showing every wire's position. Chen created a secondary map as backup. Both men knew that if they were killed, their own soldiers could blunder into the traps during counterattacks. The system went live at 2100 hours on May 13th. Hatton reported to his company commander that defensive preparations were complete. He did not specify the nature of those preparations. The after-action report would later note this omission with the dry observation. Sergeant Hatton interpreted his orders with considerable tactical flexibility. May 14th arrived with fog so thick that visibility dropped to 20 feet. At 0445 hours, Sergeant Paul Tatsuguchi's 200-man force began their infiltration. Japanese tactical doctrine emphasized speed through gaps in American lines. Get behind the defenses, attack supply routes, create chaos. The ravine appeared to offer exactly that opportunity. The first trap detonated at 0452 hours. One of Tatsuguchi's lead scouts, moving with careful silence, felt the wire against his shin a fraction of a second before his weight pulled it taut. The wedge released. The safety lever's spring mechanism made a small metallic sound. The scout had time to understand what was about to happen. He did not have time to warn anyone. The explosion killed him instantly and wounded 2 men behind him. The sound echoed through the ravine with peculiar acoustics. The volcanic rock walls amplified the blast into something that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, simultaneously. Tatsuguchi ordered his men to ground and establish security. In doing so, 3 more soldiers hit 3 more wires. What followed was not a battle in any conventional sense. It was a 6-hour nightmare where movement itself became suicidal. Japanese soldiers, some of the most disciplined and tactically proficient infantry in the world, found themselves immobilized by an enemy they couldn't see, couldn't predict, and couldn't defeat. Each attempt to advance triggered more explosions. Each attempt to withdraw created new casualties as wounded men stumbled into traps they'd bypassed on the way in. Hatton's 8-man squad fired fewer than 300 rounds during those 6 hours. They didn't need to. The grenade traps were doing the work. From their foxholes, the Americans could hear the detonations marching up and down the ravine, punctuated by shouted Japanese commands and the screams of wounded men. Occasionally, a target presented itself through the fog, and the squad's machine guns would fire disciplined bursts. Mostly they waited and listened as the defensive system did exactly what Hatton had designed it to do: create casualties, destroy cohesion, and transform an organized assault force into a scattered collection of terrified, isolated survivors. By 1100 hours, when the fog finally lifted enough for American artillery observers to bring fire onto the ravine, the Japanese attack had already collapsed. Tatsuguchi attempted to withdraw his remaining forces under cover of that bombardment. Of the 200 men who entered the ravine, 73 made it back to Japanese lines. 46 were confirmed killed by grenade traps alone. The immediate aftermath of Hatton's defense created a problem that nobody had anticipated: how to clear a defensive system that its creator had built to be undetectable. The hand-drawn maps Becker and Chen had maintained were accurate, but the fog, explosions, and artillery fire had shifted the terrain enough that using those maps required moving through areas where undetonated traps might still be active. Combat. Engineers spent 3 days clearing the ravine, using the same painstaking methodology they'd employ in a conventional minefield, except the obstacles were improvised devices that didn't conform to any recognition training. The technical assessment came from Captain Robert Shaw, the 7th Division's chief engineer, who personally walked the cleared ravine on May 17th. His report to division headquarters was simultaneously impressed and alarmed. The grenade trap system had achieved a casualty ratio that exceeded conventional minefields. Approximately 1 casualty per 0.8 grenades expended, compared to the doctrinal estimate of 1 casualty per 3 anti-personnel mines. The psychological impact appeared even more significant. Prisoner interrogations revealed that Japanese soldiers who survived the ravine engagement refused subsequent orders to advance through similar terrain, even when those areas were demonstrably free of obstacles. What engineers discovered was that Hatton had accidentally optimized for the specific tactical environment of Attu. The narrow ravine created channeling effects that made the trap spacing more effective. The persistent fog eliminated the Japanese ability to observe and map obstacle patterns. The volcanic rock prevented enemy engineers from using their standard countermine technique of digging approach trenches beneath surface obstacles. Most critically, the irregular placement pattern created an unpredictable threat that standard infantry tactics couldn't counter. Shaw's report noted the system's effectiveness derives not from the explosive power of individual grenades, but from the cumulative psychological effect of persistent, unpredictable casualties. Enemy forces demonstrated textbook small unit tactics until initial contact with the obstacle system. Subsequent behavior showed progressive degradation of unit cohesion and abandonment of tactical discipline. The revelation that made senior officers genuinely uneasy was how easily the technique could create friendly fire disasters. Hatton's meticulous mapping had prevented American casualties, but that mapping required time, planning, and, most critically, static defensive lines. The Aleutian Campaign's final weeks involved fluid combat where positions changed daily. Using similar traps in those conditions would inevitably kill American soldiers. Division headquarters faced a dilemma. Hatton's defense had objectively saved his sector and possibly prevented a breakthrough that would have jeopardized the entire operation. His violation of doctrine had achieved better results than following doctrine could have produced, but validating that decision would encourage similar improvisations in situations where the outcome might be catastrophic. The compromise solution revealed in classified after-action reports was bureaucratic and pragmatic. Hatton received a Bronze Star for valor, with a citation that referenced his skillful defensive preparations, without specifying their nature. The technique itself was documented in a restricted circulation intelligence bulletin distributed to engineer units in the Pacific Theater. That bulletin, titled Field Expedient Defensive Systems, Aleutian Experience, described the grenade trap methodology in detail, while emphasizing repeatedly that use required explicit approval from battalion-level command or higher. What made that bulletin genuinely useful was its candid assessment of when the technique worked and when it would fail. Suitable conditions included static defensive positions, detailed mapping capability, terrain that channeled enemy movement, and limited visibility that prevented obstacle observation. Unsuitable conditions included mobile operations, lack of mapping resources, open terrain, and any situation where friendly forces might need to advance through the trapped area. The broader impact was doctrinal rather than tactical. American forces in the Pacific increasingly recognized that Japanese infantry tactics, speed, infiltration, night attacks, created vulnerabilities that conventional defensive doctrine hadn't been designed to counter. Hatton's improvisation was one of dozens of field modifications that eventually influenced post-war updates to engineering doctrine, particularly regarding defensive operations against infiltration-focused opponents. Sergeant Thomas Hatton survived the Battle of Attu and went on to serve in the Philippines campaign, where he earned a Silver Star for actions during the liberation of Manila. He returned to West Virginia after the war, worked another 16 years in coal mining, and died in 1967 from black lung disease, a veteran's fate more common than anyone wants to acknowledge. His Bronze Star citation hangs in the West Virginia Veterans Memorial in Charleston, alongside 800 other medals from soldiers whose names most historians never learned. The immediate military impact of Hatton's defense was measurable and significant. The Japanese attack his traps disrupted had been intended as a diversionary assault to draw American forces away from the main defensive perimeter. When that diversion failed and took unsustainable casualties in the process, Japanese commanders abandoned their broader offensive plan. American forces maintained control of the supply routes, continued building up combat power, and ultimately retook Attu at a cost of 549 killed and 1,148 wounded. Brutal numbers, but substantially lower than pre-battle estimates that predicted over 2,000 casualties. The Japanese garrison fought with the desperation that characterized their Pacific War doctrine. Of 2,138 Japanese soldiers on Attu, only 28 survived to become prisoners. The rest died in combat or on May 29th in a final banzai charge that overran American positions through sheer willingness to absorb casualties. Sergeant Paul Tatsuguchi, the Japanese medical officer who had led the failed infiltration through Hatton's Ravine, died during that final assault. His diary, recovered from his body, provided American intelligence with one of the most detailed accounts of the Japanese soldiers' experience on Attu. His entry from May 14th simply stated, "Attempted advance through valley approach, heavy casualties from unknown weapons, attack failed." The tactical technique Hatton pioneered saw limited but documented use in subsequent Pacific campaigns. Marine Corps engineers employed similar grenade trap systems during the defense of Henderson Field on Guadalcanal in August 1943, and Army units used them during the Philippines campaign in defensive positions where conventional mines weren't available. Each use required the same prerequisites: static positions, detailed mapping, and terrain that favored the defender. The technique's long-term legacy appeared in unexpected places. During the Korean War, Chinese and North Korean forces employed tripwire-activated grenade traps extensively, having studied captured American tactical bulletins and adapted the methodology for their own operations. American forces found themselves on the receiving end of innovations their own engineers had pioneered. Vietnam-era training manuals included extensive sections on detecting and clearing improvised explosive traps directly descended from lessons learned on Attu. Modern military historians studying irregular warfare and improvised defensive systems cite Hatton's Attu defense as an early example of what doctrine would later formalize as area denial through low-density obstacles. The concept, using minimal resources to create disproportionate defensive effects through psychological impact and terrain exploitation, became foundational to conventional forces defending against numerically superior enemies. The calculation that makes Hatton's story particularly significant: his 37 grenades and 8 soldiers held a position that doctrine said required 200 men and 800 mines. The force multiplication ratio, approximately 25.1, represents one of the most efficient defensive actions in the Pacific theater, not because of superior technology or overwhelming firepower, but because one sergeant recognized that doctrine's rules existed to guide decisions, not replace thinking. Military doctrine exists because experience teaches lessons, and lessons save lives. The regulations that prohibited using grenades as booby traps were written because that practice had killed friendly soldiers in previous wars. The officers who enforced those regulations were protecting their troops from known dangers. They were doing exactly what good officers should do. Thomas Hatton broke those regulations because he faced an equation where following doctrine guaranteed failure and improvisation offered a chance at success. He didn't ignore the rules out of recklessness or contempt for authority. He violated them because the situation demanded solutions that doctrine hadn't anticipated, in terrain doctrine hadn't considered, against an enemy whose tactics doctrine hadn't yet adapted to counter. The balance between discipline and initiative defines military effectiveness. Too much adherence to doctrine creates brittle forces that break when confronting unexpected challenges. Too much improvisation creates chaos where soldiers die because nobody's following the procedures that keep operations coordinated and safe. The art is knowing when the situation demands one or the other, and having leaders who trust their people to make that judgment. One sergeant, 37 grenades. 8 soldiers holding a position sized for 200. 6 hours that changed nothing about the war's ultimate outcome, but everything about whether 47 American engineers went home when it ended. Sometimes the most dangerous thing a soldier can do is exactly what they're told. And sometimes survival requires recognizing that regulations exist to serve the mission, not replace the judgment of people who understand what the mission actually demands. If you found this story as fascinating as I did researching it, I'd appreciate if you'd like this video and subscribe to the channel. There are dozens more untold stories from World War II that deserve to be remembered. From the Aleutians to North Africa to forgotten islands in the Pacific. I'll be bringing you a new one every week. What should I cover next? Let me know in the comments below.